Imagine being taken away by a stranger to a place you don't know of, taken away from your loved ones and trapped in a home. Doesn't the scenario sound like the act of kidnapping? Imagine being treated less than everyone else in Canada. Wouldn't that feel horrible? That's how the First Nations have been treated for a very long time, and that's how they still are treated. Throughout Canada's history, overcoming injustice towards First Nations has been a constant struggle, which has demonstrated that time does not always ensure change. The First Nations were discriminated for their different ways of lifestyle, excluded for their different culture, and discriminated for being different from the French and Europeans. The First Nations were always discriminated from the new settlers and tricked and used by Europeans. For example, when the First Nations were involved in the fur trade, the Europeans gave them metal pots, knives, and other things like blankets. It happened to be that some of these blankets were the ones some Europeans wore when they had smallpox. This was one of the many ways the Europeans tricked the First Nations. The Europeans acted as if they were allies with the First Nations, when all along the First Nations were being used. The First Nations are looked upon as less than us Canadians who later settled in Canada or emigrated. The First Nations were fighting for their rights since Confederation began, and they still are fighting for their rights. For example, there is a protesting group called Idle No More. Their cause is to end social and economic inequality towards the Métis and Inuits. This is not the only issue. Over the course of time in the Canadian history, racism and discrimination took it out on the number of Aboriginal population. Even though the Canadian healthcare system has been praised as one of the best and most progressive worldwide, quality healthcare is far beyond the Canadian Aboriginals' reach. Why is it that when it comes to the Aboriginals, the Canadian government fails to show equality? The federal system had and still has continued to isolate the First Nations' access to healthcare system in Canada. It has been stated that dental decay rates for First Nation children in Ontario are 2 to 5 times higher than rates among non-First Nations. Aboriginals were fighting for their rights since the new settlers started coming to Canada. They still are fighting for their rights. This proves that history does not guarantee change. Around 1870s to 1990s, the Canadian government and the church bodies took 150 Aboriginal children from their homes and placed them at what was referred to as residential schools. Residential schools were used as the perfect weapon to destroy the culture and the identity of the Aboriginals. These residential schools were funded by the federal government and were run by the churches. These schools are where many Aboriginal children faced physical and sexual abuse. Not only did these children put up with the abuse, they were also separated from their loved ones and had their cultural identity stolen. Many Aboriginal children died because they were malnourished and were housed in a poorly ventilated building. Some Aboriginal children committed suicide, unable to bear the brutality of the schools. Many Aboriginal children were found dead after running away from the residential schools and died frozen in snowfields when it was winter. Some tried to escape and were drowned in rivers. One of the most known incidents involved the death of 4 boys: Alan Willie, Andrew Paul, Maurice Justin, and Johnny Michael, who fled the Lee Jack Residential School in British Columbia on New Year's Day, 1937. It was 30 degrees below zero. They were found frozen to death on the lake. An inquiry at that time found one boy wearing summer clothes, had no winter hat, and the rubber missing from his summer flip-flops, leaving his foot bare. Not only this, when the Aboriginal children were taken to residential schools, they were also used as experimental puppets. They were kept to starve, or also known as level diets, meaning some children were given or denied the vitamins, minerals, and certain kinds of food. Are the Aboriginals' lives not worthy enough? Is their value of life any different from ours? There are many reports calling these residential schools a fire trap. It was well known to everyone that in these residential schools, they would lock the Aboriginal children in their dormitories because they didn't want them to escape. And because of this, many Aboriginal children resulted in death when fire broke out. Many residential schools refused to spend money on fire escapes, and so instead they decided to build poles outside of the windows so that the kids can slide down in case of fire. But the windows were always kept locked, and so the kids never reached the pole and died when the fire struck. It's crazy that these minor mistakes were never fixed, because this resulted in death for many Aboriginal children. The parents of the Aboriginal children were never informed about their death of their child or what happened to their child. The European residential school system still affects our society today because there is very little Aboriginal content in our school curriculum today. What we learn is the surface information based upon the European westernized culture. Throughout our curriculums, there is a lack of cultural sensitivity in our education system today. Aboriginal injustice was and is Canada's greatest historical shame.
Imagine your house being torn down just because there's soil and minerals that people want to use on your land for mining companies. Well, that's exactly what's happening in Long Lake, where many of their homes are being teared down, leaving people homeless. Also, no one has realized how much it will cost in the end. They said it's about $50 million in investments to the area. But in situations like this, we have people that are so brave, like Teresa Spence, who started a hunger strike where she only had vitamins, fish broth, and small sips of lemon water. She was upset with the poverty, food shortages, and colonial policies in the indigenous communities, according to Leanne Simpson. So doing all this can be a great help. Also, to this day, there is many Aboriginals who are not covered by treaties because they believe it's their right. They want the right confirmed. There has been many discussions but no confirmation. This included the federal government and provincial government to regain their land that belonged to their ancestors. Aboriginal injustice has been a constant problem in Canada for many years, including nowadays. Many of these Aboriginals get taken off their land, which is unfair to them because they deserve their land. But they shouldn't have to give up their land because they are not covered by treaties. Most people should stick up for their rights, like Teresa Spence, who starved herself to end poverty and many more problems in indigenous communities. Also, it is unfair how so many Aborigines were discriminated by their cultural acts. It was cruel and uncalled for. Lastly, so many kids were killed because they were put in residential schools. Imagine being taken away from your family and loved ones to go to these schools because it was died. That's why there needs to be a change, and it starts with you.